12 seconds. That is all the world was given. Black frame, single typewritten line fades into view. Case No. SQA 202147. Declassified. Date, October 14th, 2021. Location, Northern Cascade Ridge. Coordinates, redacted. For a breath, nothing moves. Then a grainy still bleeds up from the negative. A tall, shaggy silhouette mid-stride, half-turned toward the lens. Hair clumps catch the little light that filters through the canopy. The figure is too wide at the shoulders to be a man. Too deliberate to be random. An archival voice, flat and reporter-calm, answers the blank screen. A motion camera records an upright, bipedal form for 12 seconds. The recording stops. The camera logs end abruptly. No power drain should have been possible. Stamped across the frame, in stark bureaucratic red, confidential, in the right margin, a hand-scratched note, camera offline at T+0 hours, 0 minutes, and 12 seconds, corrupted header, sensor temp spike. Another scrawl beneath, in a different ink, chain of custody intact, SD card in sealed envelope. The handwriting is the kind that belongs to investigators and overworked lab tech, slow, precise, a little tired. The file is real. The file is real. Say it now, so you don't forget the equipment, the dates, the names that will follow. We promise you this: we will examine every frame, every footprint, every anomaly. We will parse the audio, run the telemetry, test the fibers under variable light, and reconstruct the approach vector to the millimeter. We will ask the hardest question first. Was this an animal, or something that recognizes evidence and takes active steps to avoid it? This is not folklore. This is not a campfire tale handed down with flourishes. This is a raw piece of evidence from our archive, re-verified, reopened, and placed under a new chain of custody for public review. The camera was set not by thrill seekers, but by a licensed technician on contract with a conservation group. Batteries logged, timestamps synced, placement documented. The itemized checklist is attached to this file. The file is real. Listen, somewhere in the original clip, before the cut, there is an audible intake, low, human sounding, almost a sigh. We isolate it in the lab, slow it down, map its harmonics. It sits on the edge of recognizable breathing and something else, a wet rasp, a chest exhale that ends in a high-frequency pop. In the recovered footage's last audible second, you can hear that low exhalation. It hangs in stereo, raw and exposed, and then everything stops. There is no gradual fade. There's a hard, surgical cutoff. The video collapses into corrupted frames. The camera logs record a single anomalous telemetry spike at T+0 hours, 0 minutes, and 12 seconds. The lab notes that the internal temperature graph shows an immediate micro jump, then a null. Handwritten sensor temp spike, corrupted header, possible external interference. Another note, terse and clinical radio interference, reported by operator at time of event. You watch that 12-second loop and feel the absence that follows it like an open wound. The silence after the exhale is not empty, it is intentional. It insists on being listened to. On-screen text resolves, stamped in official type. You are viewing case file, the 12-second record, then nothing. The camera sits on the leeward flank of the Cascades, not in some postcard clearing, but in a narrow drainage. The maps mark in faint gray. Old-growth hemlock stands, alder thickets where daylight puddles, and a network of seasonal game trails carving through moss and fallen fir. Topography compresses here, ridgeline to valley in a sharp, 15-minute slope, creating a natural funnel. Hunters and biologists have long used that same pinch point to move between feeding grounds and high country. Animals do the same. That is why the Recon X was strapped to a sapling at 1.1 meters, aimed down the corridor like a witness in a theater aisle. Overlay the satellite imagery, a patchwork of closed canopy punctuated by clearings and a thin ribbon of creek. The weather overlay for October 14th shows low stratus hanging like a blanket, temperatures hovering between 2 and 7 degrees Celsius, and a damp that softens sound and preserves prints. Nighttime humidity was high. The creek swelled to its seasonal edge. Cell signal is a ghost, 2 bars at best on the high spur. Nothing at the camera site. There is no grid. Only a single logging spur provides access, a muddy mile of gravel that closes after the first heavy snow. That isolation matters. A remote site increases the chance an encounter goes unrecorded, and it complicates chain of custody when evidence must be physically carried out. This ridge is not new to strange reports. Local First Nations elders have stories, oral histories that use a different cadence, but the same refrain. Long-shadowed walkers that move along the river, narrows when salmon runs thin and the fog sits low. Those reports are registered in our file notes and treated with the same rigor as any witness account. Names recorded, Phrases transcribed, context noted. In the 1970s, forestry crews left behind camp impressions that turned up flattened duff, hair samples collected in pruners and preserved in ethanol jars. State labs at the time logged those materials and filed them under unidentified. The paper trail is thin but consistent. Observations clustered along the same ridge lines, always near riparian corridors where late-season nuts and root crops concentrate animal traffic. A sharper pattern emerges in modern telemetry. Since 2008, trail camera activations in this sector increased. So did reports of sudden equipment failures, cameras that died mid-clip, SD cards that returned, corrupted, batteries that read fully charged but refused to boot. These anomalies are not random. They appear most often between late September and October. Old memory suggests tied to massed years and migration pulses when animals compress into predictable routes. When we layer incidents across a 50-mile radius, the map tightens. Multiple sightings clustered along a corridor of ridge lines, 3 recovered cameras with corrupted data logged near similar pinch points, and 2 footprint casts with overlapping stride ranges. Statistically, this area reads as a hot zone, not definitive proof, but a concentration of signals that demand a higher standard of inquiry. Logistics shape everything here. Weak radio, a single access road, and the rugged anonymity of the Cascades lengthen the time between event and evidence recovery. Every handoff from field tech to lab courier is a potential break in the chain of custody, and each delay risks environmental contamination or unintentional data loss. In this case, the camera was placed by a licensed wildlife technician on contract with a conservation group. Batteries logged, timestamps synced, placement documented, but the site's geography and history mean that the footage we do have must be read against a backdrop of recurring patterns, local memory, and the practical limits of fieldwork in the mountains. Elias Mason Bray is the kind of field technician other biologists trust with their gear. Mid-30s, steady hands. A decade of protocols logged in pocket notebooks, transect surveys for the state, remote camera grids for university research, volunteer stints with local conservation groups. He has a degree in wildlife biology, certification in remote camera deployment and evidence handling, and a reputation for meticulous notes. There is no criminal record, no history of sensational claims. When Mason signs a deployment, he initials the placement diagram, records battery voltages, photographs the site from 3 angles, and timestamps every step. That baseline of professionalism is why we use a pseudonym. The stakes for him are not theoretical. Mason was contracted to monitor deer and cougar movement through a known pinch point on the leeward face of the Cascades. The Recon X Mark IV he used as standard field gear, Lee Ion Pack. External temperature telemetry, 35 field of view, mounted at 1.1 meters to capture shoulder height of ungulates. His pre-deployment log reads like a checklist. Batteries at 98%, GPS locked, time synced, SD card formatted and verified. The camera was strapped to a stake at the edge of a narrow alder opening where game funnels between creek and ridge. He scheduled a routine retrieval 3 days later. He expected, at most, a handful of deer frames and maybe a cougar silhouette. What he found complicated everything. Mason's retrieval notes remained clinical on the surface, time-stamped, terse, but the margins carried the first hints of disturbance. The camera housing was intact. The IR flash showed no obvious burn. The mount was unbroken. The SD card, however, read partially corrupted when he inserted it into his laptop. 12 seconds of a continuous file, then a string of unreadable sectors. He photographed the card, bagged it in a labeled evidence pouch, and pocketed a printed copy of the log. Those are the procedural details that protect the chain of custody. They are also the only things that stop the story from collapsing into rumor. There were other things at the scene that did not fit what Mason expected to catalog. Around the stake, the moss and lichen were pressed flat in odd crescents, as if weight had been applied and then removed. A shallow pawing in the loam did not match canid or ursid prints. The toe spread and drag suggested a longer stride. Coarse tufts of reddish-brown guard hair clung to nearby alder twigs, sheared cleanly in a way that implies contact, not caught snagging. A week earlier, a neighboring trail camera had recorded a low-frequency howl, so deep on the spectrogram it sat beneath the normal range for deer or elk, and Mason had marked that file as referred to regional. These data points are the kind that make even an experienced technician pause and reread his own notes. The human elements crowd in immediately. Mason lives 1.5 miles down the logging spur with his partner and 2 small children. He is not inclined to spectacle. He is worried about credibility. He writes in his private notebook, blunt and anxious. I don't want this on a YouTube hoax list. He knows what a single public claim could do. The laughter from colleagues, the damage to his contracts, the pressure on his family. At the same time, he recognizes a responsibility to the data to report what he found honestly and to protect the samples. The moment of retrieval registered physically. Mason described the metallic smell near the camera, faint, like the taste of an old battery or disturbed iron soil. And he noted disturbed lichen on an adjacent stump that suggested recent weight. He said the hair was coarse, almost wiry, and that the pawing showed evidence of a mid-foot flex rather than a straightforward bear pad. He photographed everything. He double-checked his logs. He sealed the SD card in a tamper-evident envelope. He drove back along the spur with the device in his truck. On that return trip, his handheld radio, normally a steady companion on the spur, sputtered with intermittent static. He recorded that audio, a low shifting hiss that would lift and collapse, then resolve into an odd single tone before the transmission faded completely. He annotated the file in his retrieval notes. Radio static, unexplained, T+. Small things like this compound. Mason had in his custody an item that could reshape a career, and at the same time he felt the pressure to silence it, to verify before he spoke, to protect his family from attention, to avoid being cataloged among the credulous. That tension between the impulse to know and the instinct to hide is part of what makes his testimony compelling and fragile. He handed the card to the regional lab the next morning under the usual protocols. The lab receipt is stamped and signed. The chain of custody is unbroken on paper, but even that careful transfer carried its own unease. Mason's last margin note reads simply, "If this is a hoax, someone is careful. If not, we need to be careful too." 0:00:01. The sensor wakes like a held breath, a mechanical click, then the faint whir of the Reconnex's autofocus motor. The frame jitters as the electronics come online. Leaves in the foreground tremble in slow motion. Somewhere downhill, water threads over cobbles. For the first human-heard sound in the clip, the camera gives a single, precise chime, a tiny, honest piece of machinery announcing it is now watching. The camera logs register the trigger, T+0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and 0 milliseconds. The frame is slightly underexposed, a blue-gray dusk settling into the canyon. 0:01:003, a vertical dark enters from the left. It is not a stumble of brush. It is purpose in motion. Long, rolling strides close the distance, hip to shoulder width, that would dwarf a local black bear if measured shoulder to shoulder. Backlight throws the subject into ragged silhouette, clumps of hair separate into distinct, windy filaments. The figure pauses, not out of instinctual alarm, but with the economy of something that has made decisions before. It tilts its head. For a fraction of a second, the subject appears to be inspecting the device. The image is a study in silhouettes, jawline, a slope of brow, the suggestion of ocular catchlight that might be wet reflection or camera artifact. The camera logs note motion detected. The file is real. 0:03:06. The figure leans forward into the frame as if considering proximity. A soft, exhaled grunt rides the track, low, wet, like wind through a closed throat. The bushes shudder where an arm brushes them. A highlight catches on what could be an eye or the wet membrane of a nasal cavity. The camera hum becomes louder. For 2 heartbeats, the audio drops to near silence in the recovered clip, a blacked-out audio gap that reads like a held breath. This silence is deliberate in the footage and deliberate for us. The absence of sound becomes a weight. The subject's shoulders flex. Muscle moves beneath dense pelage. At T+0:04:7, the frame shows a hand, or something hand-like, approach the lens. Finger-length appendages dark against the camera's plastic casing. 0:06:09. Movement shifts laterally. Now, there is no ambiguity. The gait is bipedal. The femur swing, the torso counter-rotation, the long pendulum of an upper limb clearing brush. These are not the short, rolling steps of ursids. Measured across consecutive frames, stride averages between 4.2 and 4.8 feet. A distant branch snaps. The sound is sudden and metallic in the track, and a microglitch ripples the image as if the sensor hiccups. The camera logs later show a transient frame stutter here. The creature's passage is deliberate, economical, a traveler moving a known path, glancing at an unexpected object in its way. 0:09:011. The subject turns its head directly toward the lens. For the first time, the viewer feels observed. Facial detail remains buried in shadow, but you can make out a slope where nose meets brow and a suggestion of a heavy jaw. A rasped intake of breath fills the audio, a blade of sound that carries harmonic content low on the spectrogram, and a high-pitched overtone that pricks the audio channel. The figure reaches out, not in a violent strike but in investigatory contact. The hand covers the lens briefly. The camera attempts to refocus, its micromotor whining in protest. This is where the footage leans into something more than animal curiosity. The subject behaves like an entity that understands cause and effect to a minimal degree. Touch camera, camera reacts. 011s, 011s, 012, 1 frame. A blur passes across the lens, wet, fibrous, impossibly close. An electrical pop marks the audio at exactly T+0 minutes, 11 seconds and 95 milliseconds. A single bright spike across channels like a tiny lightning strike inside the recorder. Then the file cuts. Abruptly, mid-breath, the image goes to black and the audio dies in a way that is not fade or gradual corruption, but hard stop, a surgical end. When Mason found the device 3 days later, he would tell us the file contained those 12 seconds intact up to the final electrical pop, followed by an immediate run of corrupted frames and a read error on the card. He recalls pocketing the SD in a tamper-evident envelope with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the strangeness of what he'd seen. He remembers a metallic smell in the air near the camera, like old batteries or iron dust. He remembers the lichen pulled loose from a stump where something had leaned, and a single, coarse hair snagged on a branch within reach of the lens. He also remembers his handheld radio going dead that exact moment. He wrote that down in the margins of his field book. Radio cuts at clip end, tone, then silence. The correlation is not proof, but it is a pattern. The camera logs give us the same finality: power nominal at trigger, system nominal at T+011, then an abrupt shutdown and file system corruption. The file is real. The camera logs are real. The silence afterward, the silence that falls over the clip and over the recording, technician in his truck hours later, is its own kind of evidence. We play that silence in the edit and hold it. The audience waits into it because it is where the unanswered question sits. Something came close enough to touch our technology and the recording stopped. 12 seconds. 12 seconds of contact, inspection, and then a blank where we expected explanation. The cut feels like a wound in the record, and it insists upon a question we are not ready to answer out loud. The file is real. The camera logs are real. We say that twice because the temptation at this point in any investigation is to collapse into doubt, to call it a bad card, a prank, a quirk of old electronics. So we start by anchoring what is verifiable. The clip runs at 30 frames per second. Time code begins at 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and 0 milliseconds, and ends abruptly at 0 hours, 0 minutes, 12 seconds, and 0 milliseconds. Frame-by-frame extraction gives us 360 frames to analyze. 359 of them are intact. The last frame shows a blurred mass crossing the lens at T=11. 95 seconds, a single sharp broadband spike tears through every audio channel simultaneously, a bright electrical transient, visible on the spectrogram as an almost vertical line that saturates from 20 Hz to well above 20 kHz. Then, nothing. The recording stops as if a switch has been thrown. Image analysis yields repeatable, measurable data. Using reference vegetation and the camera's fixed mounting height 1 meters. Triangulation on limb angles and background topography produces a conservative estimate. Shoulder height between 6.5 and 7.2 feet. Stride length approximated at 4.2 to 4.8 feet. The gait is bipedal, with a long femoral swing and an arm swing that clears brush. Metrics inconsistent with local ursides and falling at the larger end of hominid estimates elsewhere in the archive. Audio analysis is where the anomaly thickens. The low-frequency components of the 12-second track cluster below 60 Hz. These harmonics do not match cataloged vocalizations of deer, elk, or bear. There is an exhalation-like grunt at roughly 3.2 seconds with spectral energy concentrated in subsonic bands. Harmonics climb unpredictably, suggesting a sound source that couples into the ground as much as into air. The electrical spike at 95s is not an audio artifact. It appears identically across 4 isolated channels, recorded by independent input stages, and shows up as a transient in the camera's internal power monitoring trace. Independent spectral decomposition of that transient shows a near-flat energy distribution across a wide band, the signature of an electromagnetic or electrostatic discharge, not normal environmental noise. Forensics from the strike zone provide corroborating, if incomplete, physical evidence. 8 meters from the camera, we cast a footprint, length 17.5 inches, pronounced mid-tarsal break, a broad ball with a splayed forefoot impression. Substrate conditions, compacted loam over decayed, would preserve pressure points but not dermal ridges. The mid-tarsal articulation is not a bare print. It aligns, however, with several other casts in the archive that show similar weight distribution and joint flexion. Near the camera strap, a single coarse hair was snagged on a twig. Microscopy describes guard hairs with a thick, continuous medulla and a pigment pattern not consistent with Ursus americanus. The cortex is heavily pigmented. Scale casts are inconclusive, pending a fuller lab run that will include mitochondrial DNA screening. The testing is expedited, but for now, the hair sits in the chain of custody sealed bag, labeled, logged, and refrigerated. The chain of custody matters. Mason placed the SD in a tamper-evident envelope, initialed it, and recorded the find in his field book. The file is real. The evidence was secured. The SD card's metadata tells its own strange story. Allocation tables are not sequential. Several file headers show signs of abrupt trink. Power telemetry from the Recon X Mark IV shows battery state of charge at 98% at trigger. Nominal internal temperature, no error flags until the abrupt shutdown at the clip's end. The card casing, when scanned with a handheld Gauss meter, registered a small but measurable magnetic anomaly localized to the connector area, not what we would expect from background. That measurement was replicated twice by separate technicians before the card was placed into quarantine. Chain of custody interruptions compound the technical anomalies. When Mason handed the card to the regional lab, their initial sector read produced a 12-second clip and then returned a read error. Interrupt. Lab logs show that during the first forensic read, an analyzer experienced a 3-second instrument fault flagged as an external IU interruption. Engineers could not reproduce that fault under controlled conditions later. Around the same time, radio logs from Mason and a local ranger show correlated interference. Mason's handheld went dead the instant the clip terminated. The ranger reported deafening static followed by a pure tone at approximately 12 kHz lasting several minutes. Those radio files have been ingested and archived. They are real. Expert review splits opinion in productive ways. A primatologist notes that gait mechanics, limb proportions, stride, pelvis rotation suggest a large hominid capable of sustained bipedal locomotion, but she signals caution. Hair length, suggested shoulder mass, and the apparent inspection behavior are atypical for any known ape or bear behavior cataloged in North America. An electrical engineer, brought in to assess the spike, maps the transient against known electromagnetic interference profiles. He states bluntly that a close proximity electromagnetic discharge, large enough to corrupt flash memory, could explain the file corruption. But he also admits a crucial limitation. No known mammal produces an EMP-like pulse. He therefore posits 3 explanations: coincident environmental discharge, faulty wiring near the site, lightning, anthropogenic interference, deliberate electronic sabotage, or an unknown source. He cannot, on technical grounds alone, attribute intent. That gap, the inability to reduce the interruption to a single, conventional cause, is the critical anomaly. On one axis, we have tangible data, frame rates, stride lengths, spectrograms, footprint casts, a hair sample, logs that show power, nominal, then dead. On the other, we have synchronous equipment failures beyond simple file corruption, radios, lab analyzers, the camera itself. The correlation is not proof of agency. It is, however, a pattern. It forces the question the file refuses to answer. Did something close to the device cause the shutdown? Or did some external condition coincide so precisely with the camera's last breath that coincidence becomes improbable? We catalog what we do not know as carefully as what we do. The hair is pinning DNA. The card awaits a deeper forensic read in a shielded environment. The footprint cast will be re-examined with gait-matched 3D modeling. The file is real. The camera logs are real. And the interruption remains the wound in the record that keeps this case open. When we widen the lens beyond SQA 202147, a pattern emerges, not a scattershot collection of anomalies, but a corridor of repetition stretching across the leeward Cascades. In the archive overlay, 5 incidents light up within a roughly 100-mile arc centered on the ridge where Mason found his camera. Each file reads like a variant on the same short. Strange sentence, seconds of clear footage, an inspection, an interruption, and then the machine's last breath. Lower Quinault, September 2009, an 11-second clip showing a tall, broad-shouldered figure pause and peer into a lens. Battery telemetry, nominal, at trigger. File system corrupted at T+0 hours, 0 minutes and 11 seconds. Regional walkie, broken by a high-pitched tone for 5 minutes thereafter. Sands Hollow, October October 2014. 13 seconds of footage, a sudden lateral step, a snapped sapling, a loud exhalation, followed by a broadband transient on the audio spectrogram and a corrupted SD card that later showed non-sequential fat entries. Blue Water Creek, late September 2016, a 9-second approach, close inspection, and a complete electromagnetic spike recorded. Simultaneously on the trail camera and a ranger's radio, the ranger reported a period of deafening, static, and then silence. Tumbro Pass, October 2018, a 7-second howl, clip that coincided with a road closure after motorists reported an unearthly tone over CB channels. Howell Ridge, 1998, an older file we've reprocessed, shows the same cut to black at roughly 11 seconds in a walkie-talkie tone that regional logbooks still list as unexplained interference. 3 cases in particular, Quinault, Bluewater, and Mason's Ridge, share nearly identical telemetry anomalies. Cameras report charge between 92 to 99% at trigger, internal temperature normal, then an immediate non-graceful system halt. Multiple independent observers logged radio interference in the same minute. File allocation tables are scrambled in the same non-random way. The repeated elements are too specific to dismiss as purely coincidental. They form a signature. Morphologically, the clips and casts converge. Measured stride lengths cluster in the 4 to 5 foot range. Shoulder heights estimate between 6 and 7.5 feet. Multiple footprint casts, separated by years and miles, show a pronounced mid-tarsal flexion and a weight distribution, concentrated on a broad forefoot rather than a narrow heel strike typical of ursids. Pelage descriptions are consistent. Long, coarse-guard hairs, reddish to dark brown in different light, sometimes matted with what looks like pine resin. Where hair samples exist, preliminary microscopy rules out regional black and brown bears. Keratin structure and medullary patterns are unusual, though not yet conclusively exotic. The morphological consistency across incidents suggests either a single, wide-ranging population or a repeated behavioral template among related individuals. Behaviorally, the incidents share choreography. The subject approaches devices placed in pinch points, the same travel corridors humans and game use often in low light. It pauses, inspects the camera at close range, and appears to assess the machine before an abrupt interruption. The pause is crucial. It implies deliberate agency rather than random passage. In at least 4 clips, the subject's attention centers on the device, head tilt, reaching motion, minute sway gestures we interpret as inspection. That inspection, more often than not, ends not with a slow retreat but with a sudden technological failure. The camera dies. Files scramble, radios crackle out. Technological interference is the most unnerving common denominator. Across multiple incidents, the catalog records similar error signatures, non-sequential fat corruption, instantaneous shutdowns, and electromagnetic transients visible both on audio spectrograms as broadband spikes and on equipment logs as anomalous current draws. Several observers reported radio phenomena, sustained tones, static bursts, or immediate dead air, contemporaneous with the clip termination. The electrical engineer on our team mapped these transients against known interference profiles and found no perfect match. The patterns overlap with short, localized discharges but lack a clear external source, like lightning or nearby high-voltage lines. The recurring timing, an interference event occurring within a second of the visual cut, is the statistical nail that refuses simple explanation. Skeptical alternatives demand attention. Hoaxing can reproduce a gait, stage a reach, even place hair samples, but it struggles to account for independent telemetry anomalies recorded by disparate devices and the spontaneous radio interference that coincides with multiple events. Environmental failure, moisture, cold, mechanical shock explains some corrupted files, yet fails to account for simultaneous electromagnetic signatures and consistent mid-tarsal prints found in different substrates. Sabotage remains possible in principle, but coordinated. Clandestine interference across decades. Agencies and remote locations would require infrastructure and motive we have not yet seen evidence of. So we map pattern to question. Are we observing a repeated interaction, an animal that notices and manipulates our technology, or are we watching a chain of coincident failures amplified by human pattern seeking? The archive leans toward the former, not because we want it to, but because the data, when read together, do not scatter. They line up. Approach, inspect, interrupt, cut to black, chain of custody disrupted. The file is real. The pattern is real. That pattern forces an ethical and operational rethink. If this subject recognizes cameras and can neutralize or avoid them, our standard surveillance becomes not a neutral eye, but a provocation. We must ask, are our methods biasing the data, inviting engagement from something that can choose to engage or withdraw? And strategically, if the phenomenon is adaptive, then our next deployments must be different, redundant, shielded, anonymous. We close the map overlay and keep the pins in place because this corridor, these repeated incidents, is now the frame through which the file must be read. The record pushes us toward a hypothesis that will demand testing, and it makes a simple, chilling claim. Something in these mountains is not merely avoiding notice, it is, in its own way, noticing us. There are 3 sober ways to read the evidence in case SQA 202-147. Each is conditional, each can be tested, each raises a different set of implications. Hypothesis A, a large, bipedal mammal with investigatory behavior. The subject approaches, inspects, and then either withdraws or actively interrupts recording. The gait metrics, the pause to inspect behavior, the repeated mid-tarsal footprint morphology, and the presence of coarse guard hairs across independent incidents all support this. The pattern approach, inspect, interrupt, cut to black, repeats across the corridor. The file is real. The file is real. Hypothesis B, coincident environmental or equipment failure. Trail cameras in cold, damp, mechanically stressed environments do fail, and flash memory is vulnerable to corruption. Some corrupt files can be explained by moisture infiltration, thermal cycling, or simple mechanical shock. Electronic transients can occur. Sabotage and hoaxing also fall into this umbrella. A well-executed hoax can mimic gait, deposit hair, and stage prints. Hypothesis C, interaction with a localized electromagnetic or ionic phenomenon. Multiple independent observers logged radio static and a sharp broadband spike at the moment recordings terminated. An electrical engineer consulted for this case offered a measured opinion. An intense, localized transient, if existed, could corrupt flash storage and produce the simultaneous radio interference we observed. No known wild animal produces an but neither does any currently cataloged mammal reliably produce a repeatable, device-level electromagnetic discharge. We weigh these alternatives against the body of data. Biological metrics favor hypothesis A. Stride, shoulder height, arm swing, and pelage are internally consistent and recur across different substrates and cameras. Technical anomalous simultaneous audio spikes, non-sequential file allocation tables, walkie-talkie static at 12 kHz resist tidy explanation by standard camera failure alone. Hoaxing is not impossible, but to argue sabotage at scale requires a motive, manpower, and access across decades and agencies we have yet to document. Experts split the difference, and their voices matter. A primatologist notes the gait and arm-to-leg proportions are primate-like but atypical in scale. A forensic hair analyst urges caution. Guard hair morphology is suggestive but not definitive without mitochondrial and nuclear DNA profiles. An electrical engineer advises that an electromagnetic event could, in theory, corrupt flash memory and radios, but produces no precedent linking a biological organism to such a discharge. Each expert files a careful caveat. None claims certainty. That lack of certainty is the point. The proper scientific posture here is conditional hypothesis and rigorous falsifiability. To move from suggestion to proof, we need experiments designed to close the gaps the archive currently leaves open. What would falsify hypothesis A? Deployments that remove human tampering and environmental confounds, redundant. Shielded sensor arrays, Faraday caged image units, alongside unshielded cameras, simultaneous multi-angle high frame rate optical capture. Continuous magnetometer and broadband M-logging, thermal and LiDAR recording, and immediate recovery protocols that reduce chain of custody gaps to hours, not days. Each device must write to multiple independent media-local encrypted storage, mirrored live telemetry to a secure transmitter, and an off-site redundancy. So a single corrupt medium cannot erase the event. We must also include calibrated acoustic arrays and a DNA-grade collection protocol at every site. Sterile swabs, immediate cold storage, triple witnessed transfers. Finally, deploy decoy and neutral objects to test object-specific reaction. Do subjects react to cameras, to humans, or to novel artifacts in general? Those are the experiments. They are costly, logistically brutal, and ethically fraught. Here is the investigator's admission, and it is quieter than TV wants it to be. After a decade of cataloging similar files, reviewing casts, reading corrupted metadata, I am uneasy in a way that goes beyond professional curiosity. There is a particular dread in the possibility that whatever we are looking at does not merely avoid our view, it recognizes and manipulates our tools. If the subject can choose to neutralize recording devices, we are not merely failing to observe, we are being managed. That is a different relationship. From observer, to provocation, to interlocutor. That fear is not a flourish. It matters for method and for ethics. If an organism demonstrates adaptive responses to surveillance, our deployments could be an act of interference, not passive observation. We must then ask whether continued intrusive monitoring is defensible, and whether we are ethically obligated to change. Tactics move from covert capture to observational distance, from baited cameras to non-interactive surveying, from ad hoc retrieval to rapid, minimally invasive evidence recovery. We close this section with what we will do next. Prioritize shielded, redundant deployments in the corridor, fast response recovery teams with forensic chains of custody, full genomic analysis of remaining hair samples, and controlled experiments that separate device failure from intentional interruption. The data will decide. Until then, we return to the footage. 12 seconds, a silhouette leans in, a rasp of breath, a spike on the spectrogram, then black, chain of custody. Chain of custody. The file is real, the pattern is real. The question that remains is not whether the footage exists, it does, but what, exactly, is responding to us when the lens opens. We close where the footage stops, not because the story ends there, but because the interruption forces us to choose our next steps. 12 seconds gave us measurable things. Gait metrics, a low-frequency signature. Guard hairs, a footprint cast. 12 seconds gave us an event pattern that recurs across decades. 12 seconds left us with a broken file and a question that will not be answered by speculation alone. The file is real. Chain of custody. Chain of custody. Say those details out loud until the words stop being comfortable. The evidence is not a viral clip or another anonymous upload. This came from a credentialed technician, recovered in the field, logged, and handed over through standard regional lab protocols. The footage exists. The pattern exists. What it means is, the work ahead? What we need next is simple in outline and brutal in execution. First, the remaining biological samples course, hairs clipped from a low branch, must be pushed through expedited, contaminant-controlled genomic sequencing. Not a single step can be short-circuited. Decontamination logs, negative controls, blind replicates. If the sequences return to known Ursidae, we close a lot of loose ends. If they do not, the archive widens. Second, the corrupted SD card requires a full forensic read, using independent labs with different imaging hardware and software stacks. Corrupted flash can sometimes be coaxed into yielding SLAC data. Unusual magnetic signatures on the casing demand cleanroom inspection. We will publish the raw offsets, the hex dumps, the failed frames. Transparency is our defense against both hoax accusations and interpretation bias. Third, field protocol changes. We will deploy shielded, redundant sensor suites along the ridge, Faraday cage enclosures, analog audio backups, synchronized multi-angle cameras, and passive thermal arrays. These systems are costly and difficult to install on steep, wet ridge lines. They are also necessary if the subject, whatever it is interacting selectively with single devices. If you want to know whether something is neutralizing a camera or whether flash memory is failing in cold, you test with redundancy. If 3 independent systems fail in the same instant, human error becomes less plausible. Fourth, repeat response recovery teams. No single operator should be the only custodian of evidence. Within hours of any activation, trained technicians with forensic chains of custody and minimal footprints will recover devices, bag them, and move them to secure labs. This reduces contamination and the temptation, practical and social, to either hide or sensationalize a find. Fifth, controlled experiments and ethical review. We will run neutral object trials to see whether approach behavior is object-specific. Do subjects inspect cameras, or do they simply react to novel artifacts? Those trials will be overseen by institutional review boards that weigh both scientific value and potential harm. If an organism actively avoids intrusive devices, the ethical calculus changes. Our methods must not treat sentient creatures as persistence campaigns. There are practical asks. The archive will publish the lab schedule and the raw frames as they are cleared for release. We will accept submissions time-stamped, metadata intact through a secure evidence portal. We will not entertain clips without chain of custody or that lack original metadata. Such files add noise, not clarity. If you contributed to the Howl Ridge tape, or if you have a walkie-talkie recording with the same 12 kHz tone, reach out. Exact time codes matter. Exact device logs matter. The data, not the story, will move us forward. We need funding to build shielded arrays and to underwrite rapid recovery teams. We need collaborators in electrophysiology, primate biomechanics, and flash memory forensics. We need ethical oversight to guide how we observe. Subscribe to the archive for the next releases: the expedited hair report, the forensic read, the raw frame sets with synchronized audio, and the field team raid log. Help fund the shielded sensor trials if you value empirical answers over viral certainty. And yes, there is a next file. Next week, the 7-second howl that triggered a road closure. We will reopen that case with the same rigor, the same skepticism, and the same willingness to be proven wrong. We return again to the image, a silhouette frozen mid-step, hair clumped, shoulder angled, head cocked, as if listening. A rasp of breath is still audible in the mind. The spectrogram shows a spike and then a blackout. The file is real. Slow fade to the original frame. Superimposed, stamped, in archival red. File status, ongoing investigation, do not distribute. Then black.